Lifted Drinks. Join the party, skip the hangover. Created by hemp and cannabis lovers, Lifted is an amazing, tasty, non alcoholic beverage created to improve any evening in or weekend out. Lifted is 100% hemp cannabis, 100% consistent, 100% of the time. We could ship anywhere in the US. Just add ice or mix it with your favorite beverage. Check them out at lifteddrinks.com. That's LYFTED drinks.com. Enter in radio to get a 20% discount at checkout. You must be 21 or over to join the party and skip the hangover. You'll never be caught needing to replenish your stash again when you subscribe to Hemper's monthly smoking boxes. Hemper's hands down the best place to stock up on your smoking supplies no matter the occasion. Curated with innovative and hand-selected products to ensure you're getting the absolute highest quality accessories for your smoking experience. Hemper's monthly smoking subscription service provides $100 plus in value for only $40. There's also the convenient options to receive every month, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. And right now, use promo code HEDGE10 to get started and receive 10% off Hemper's box or the XL box at hemper.com.
Well, I don't know about you out there watching in internet land, but when it gets to be Friday, there's a sense of relief, I would think, in all of our lives. Some have more stressful lives than others. I'll put mine up against anybody's stress at this point. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Green Rush Live, our regularly scheduled business cannabis talk show or cannabis business talk show, depending on which way you listen. We are so excited about talking about this subject today because of what happened in Washington, D.C. yesterday. And if it sounds familiar, like a deja vu all over again, it's exactly almost to the week when Chuck Schumer introduced federal legalization framework for draft purposes, for feedback purposes. And it took him a year to basically re-release it after getting some feedback from the industry. Now, joining me as co-host today will be Josh Kincaid, he of the Talking Hedge, he from Washington State. Hello, Josh. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jimmy.
And as always, it's usually the third Friday of every month, but we skipped the first one just because we were on vacation. Morgan Fox from NORML joins us from Washington, D.C. And obviously, there's a buzz in Washington, D.C. that has nothing to do with the hearings from the last couple of days. It actually has to do from the cannabis industry because there's hope on the horizon that perhaps something in a reform package will actually get to the floor to be debated by the U.S. Senate. Morgan Fox, thank you again for joining us. What's your reactions to what went on yesterday?
Well, it was great to finally see this legislation actually be officially introduced after waiting, a year from seeing the draft legislation. And it was also great to see that the engagement that Senate Majority Leadership has had with stakeholders across the political spectrum has actually made it into the bill in a lot of places. I think that this is kind of unique experience for us that not only do we have leadership promoting cannabis policy reform, but we actually also have them actively listening to what people are saying. Clearly there are still going to be some problems with this bill that we all have to dig into over the coming months, but overall, I'm pretty happy with it. Even though it probably doesn't have the votes to pass this year, at the very least, it's going to be able to facilitate really substantive conversations about cannabis policy reform, both comprehensive and incremental. And we've already got our first hearing set up in the Judiciary Subcommittee for Counterterrorism and Crime on Tuesday. So already this bill is having one of my desired effects.
There you go. You said that this bill has changed a little bit from the original draft. One of the things that stuck out on that original draft was an exorbitant federal tax. Please tell me that they've brought that down a little bit.
Not particularly, and that's definitely something that we're going to have to work on. Big businesses are going to pay starting at 10% and then moving up to 25% after 5 years. Small businesses are going to pay 5%, moving up to 12.5% after 5 years. And honestly, that's just too much. And, lawmakers need to realize that when you're dealing with an established unregulated market competition, you need to set the tax rates as low as possible in order to help displace that market. And if you do that, then you will be able to realize much greater tax revenues in the long term in order to be able to fund all of the restorative justice programs that we absolutely want to fund that are included in this legislation.
There you go. Josh, you're someone who has looked at far more spreadsheets than I have. Does it seem that the federal government is doing everything they possibly can to kind of slow down the green rush in Washington, D.C. and make it as difficult as possible for this industry to survive?
This one seems really vague, where they want to have a lot of bureaucracy involved. There's at least 3 federal bureaus that are involved at minimum, right? And then they kind of throw in random stuff in there like, we're going to ban all additives in vapes, natural or otherwise. So there's a lot of different things coming out here. So it's obviously built and developed by lobbyists for their clients. And it's not really to kind of drive a path, in my opinion. So no, this is kind of just throwing a blanket out there. And I'm not really sure if it's going to solve anything, because it seems that they're building a lot without thinking it through. And how that's going to actually be executed is probably a nightmare.
I mean, I would actually kind of go at it in a little bit of the opposite direction, that this bill actually represents a lot of problems for the industry, and particularly larger businesses. So, I mean, I don't necessarily think that it is being tailored to the lobbyists. I think it's more being tailored to the lawmakers that are either misinformed or are just not knowledgeable enough about the actual needs of the industry or of regulated cannabis systems, period. But that being said, they did take a lot of people's input into account. And, overall, I think that, this bill is clearly going to have to be tweaked a little bit. But, the fact remains that it doesn't have the votes to pass in the current Congress. So it does represent an excellent starting point for conversations that are much more substantive and much more farther reaching than we've ever had in the Senate. And so now we have the opportunity to actually have legislation to look at and to start debating some of the finer points of exactly how to end prohibition. And I think one of the good things that will come from this bill, I mean, my fingers crossed, that we will be able to pull some parts of this, or at least the legislation will be able to help us inform our discussions about potentially passing more incremental legislation like banking and expungement and potentially access for small businesses to the SBA program. That will be a huge step forward. And while, clearly won't end prohibition, which is what we all want to happen, will get us farther in that direction than we could have had we not gotten the go-ahead to actually start talking about those issues with the introduction of this bill.
We've had your old pal Michael Correa on here a bunch of times, and he always referred to the safe banking as low-hanging fruit. It's part of this bill. Is that the one thing that you think the other side of the aisle will be willing to accept? And maybe that is the incremental step you're looking for?
Well, I think the GOP would support safe banking before almost any other sort of positive cannabis policy reforms. That being said, the Democrats want to see that be beefed up a little bit in order to help protect against predatory lending and make sure that small businesses, particularly those represented by marginalized communities, are able to access the benefits that could come with having safe harbor for financial institutions to be able to work with cannabis companies. And so the language that's in CAOA kind of provides a blueprint for exactly what Democrats want to see when it comes to banking language. Some of that stuff might be a little bit too far for the GOP to get on board with, but I think that it does provide a pathway in terms of language that specifically protects against predatory or discriminatory practices, and also provides guidance for the financial services industry to know exactly how to interact with the cannabis industry in a way that's not going to draw congressional ire.
Yeah. Josh, are you confident at all about this or not?
No, I was in banking. I just look at this launch of a 10-year pilot program for small business administration, and I never in my entire career saw one SBA loan go through. So I think that they've got a laundry list of catchphrases that sound good on paper, but like I was mentioning, the execution of this, I'm not. I just don't. I think it's going to be like walking through molasses. It's going to be really slow if it works at all. And being in Washington, one of the first states that did regulate cannabis, we pushed it through thinking like if there's something wrong, we'll just go back and change it. And things don't work out like that. Kind of like the Class C felony on maintaining and operating a marijuana lounge. The felony that they put on there was in 2016 or 2015, and it still is there. So there's like no room for talking about certain laws or overturning, these rules. So I would look at something like an equitable licensing grant program being something that they need, but how's it going to be executed? And we talk about offering these equity licenses, and it doesn't ever seem to come to fruition yet. It seems really slow. So if it does happen, that's great. But I think that there's a lot of things that are on the paper here, but like I mentioned, the execution of it, I'm not going to hold my breath.
Yeah, well, I mean, Washington State has had, it still hasn't been able to legalize home cultivation, and is just now getting around to having serious conversations about social equity and licensing. Some states have gone faster than that. Some states have gone way slower than that. But I think you're absolutely right. Once the law is written, it's very difficult to get changes in it. Sometimes it can be a bit of an uphill battle. So I think it's very important at the federal level that we get this right the first time, or at least as close as we can. And then if we need to go back and make changes, then we have the opportunity to do so. But they should be the smallest changes that we can possibly manage so that we can actually make them be a little bit more doable.
Is this creating a federal, you told me, I heard 3 different divisions at the federal level to oversee the industry, or are they going to piggyback off the alcohol and beverage and FDA and the DEA, the Department of Agriculture? Have they picked 3 that they like and that they are going to try and work with, or are they creating more bureaucracy at the federal level with this bill?
Yeah.
So Treasury would be in charge of a lot of the taxation and licensing issues, but then most of the regulatory issues would be controlled by the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, the FDA, and the ATF. But while this bill actually does create a lot of the structure for that beforehand, there would still be a lot of questions that need to be answered in terms of individual agency policy decisions and developments of those specific policies. That being said, it also creates additional departments within existing agencies to deal with things like the Opportunity Fund and the Cannabis Justice Department. So there would be additional bureaucracy involved there, but at the same time, I think that it's absolutely necessary in some cases to create that, because there are things that are specific about the cannabis industry and about cannabis policy generally that aren't necessarily immediately one-to-one transferable with other agencies' responsibilities, and that need to have experts placed in charge of it that have knowledge on the specific issue space, as opposed to just trying to shoehorn it into existing agency responsibilities.
Yeah, Gorski in our chat room brings up a great point, and it's something I hear often when I'm out in the trenches at different dispensaries or trade shows, that it almost seems like they want the small businesses to fail, and that kind of opens the door for the big MSOs who continue to just get bigger and bigger. And Josh, your comment about the SBA in general kind of freaks me out a little bit, because how are we ever going to grow, our economy without the power of small business, because small business eventually could become big business if they're successful. But if there's so many roadblocks, there's almost like a drive to the end, the end and failure. And that concerns me. Morgan, I know that you're not in charge. You're not the cannabis czar, but if you were, what exactly would you like to, what is the framework? Is decriminalization and descheduling and the banking, those are the three biggest issues, aren't they?
Well, I mean, descheduling takes care of decriminalization
Right.
de facto. And obviously, like, we cannot move forward with a rational and sensible national cannabis policy without descheduling. Rescheduling is going to be a nightmare for the states if they wanted to get into compliance. I mean, they're out of compliance now, but if they wanted to get into compliance with like a Schedule 2 or a Schedule 3 setup, it would be a total disaster and would basically gut every single existing medical and adult use system. So, descheduling is really the ultimate goal, but there are all sorts of things that we need to consider along with that. And I mean, there are a lot of other issues just beyond that related to things like interstate commerce and exactly what that looks like. What does import export look like? Really top of mind for me is, what does the tax rate look like? Because the existing tax rate is just simply too high. Compared to the SRA or the MORE Act. We're looking at just a massive tax rate that, at the end of this 5-year implementation period would be almost on par with where a lot of businesses are with 280E at this point. And that's not a good way to disrupt the unregulated market and bring in more tax revenue overall. So, aside from everything else that we're talking about this bill, we really need to look at the taxes involved, because that is going to be something that is going to be hobbling the industry from day one.
Didn't this happen in California recently? Didn't they have to change the tax code?
Yeah, they just reduced the taxes pretty heavily. I think that's not without precedent either. Colorado has done that in the past. I think several other states have done so as well. Which is kind of mind-blowing when you look at policy overall, because it's really hard to get politicians to drop the taxes on anything once they get used to that revenue. But I think that there is enough of a groundswell of support for decreasing taxes on the cannabis industry so that it can be more competitive with the existing unregulated market, that politicians are actually starting to listen and are starting to realize that this is a way to get more tax revenue in the long term.
Right. And it's not going away. I mean, there's 19 states now that have adult use programs. Some are vibrant and have been around for a long time, like Washington State and Colorado, and some are barely getting going, like New Jersey and New York. And I keep hearing good things about the New York State's issuing of licenses to the economic empowered applicants that are out there. And I find that to be a great development. New York is trying to do it right. Is that how you view what's going on in New York, Morgan?
It's definitely moving in the right direction, and I think it's one of the most forward-thinking programs that we've seen so far. We're going to have to see how it actually turns out. We've seen in cases like Illinois where there were a lot of good intentions, and then the actual application and implementation did not really turn out the way that people wanted it to, and then things got bogged down in lawsuits. Meanwhile, the bigger businesses are further getting entrenched in and like solidifying their market share, while everybody else is fighting over the scraps. I think this isn't something that necessarily is an issue at the federal level, but it could become so when you start getting into interstate commerce, is that we need to get rid of license caps, period. License caps are the biggest problem for competitiveness in this industry.
Mhm.
So 3 isn't going to be enough per state. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, there should be zero license caps anywhere.
Free market.
Yeah, honestly, like social equity programs should be more based upon providing funding mechanisms and additional training and assistance to qualifying members, as opposed to having a specific set of licenses that are devoted to them, because there are a ton of problems with that already. But also, the people that are trying to get these licenses are competing against each other instead of competing against the larger market. If we get rid of license caps, you drop the barriers to entry significantly across the board and give everybody a chance to be successful.
Well, it sounds like, see, you convince me every time you come on the show. I'm easily convinced too, I might add. But I always think that there's a simple way to success here. And whenever a government gets involved, they just make it more and more complicated with more and more layers of government and bureaucracy and rules and regulations. And we all recognize that this is the most regulated industry that has launched and has been as successful in its first decade. But how, let me ask you a question, Morgan. When you go in, you talk to a member of the GOP, okay, who is adamant about legalizing, decriminalizing, opening the banks for cannabis. How do you break them down? How do you rationally try to explain to them why that makes that type of thinking is passé?
Well, it really depends on the individual and exactly where their pressure points and priorities are. Some of them are more interested in states' rights. Some of them are more interested in free markets. Some of them are more interested in controlling the cannabis industry in such a way as to supposedly, minimize consumption, period, both adults and teens. And you just have to show them the science and the experiences of these other states and show them, like, look, the states that have either much more open licensing programs, have more competitive businesses, and have more small businesses that are successful. Every state that regulates cannabis has either flatline or decreased teen usage. It just really depends on exactly what their pressure points and concerns are. And luckily, we've got the science behind us.
And I always bring up the Colorado study now that shows that teen use in Colorado has gone down since legalization. So to me, there's no better set of results or research to share with those who always talk, well, what about the kids? And I keep saying the kids know more about this than the adults did 30, 40, 50 years ago. They still do. That being said, we need to educate the parents. We need to educate the small town politicians, and as well as the entire public, which, with no public service announcements and no anything that major media is doing. Let me ask you a question, Josh and Morgan. Did anybody see a story on national news about what happened yesterday, Morgan?
Yeah, a fair amount.
Okay.
But I mean, going back to your earlier point, some of the things that prohibitionists like to talk about a lot are, the teen use rate. And we saw that in the last year or so, Colorado teen use has dropped by something like 30%. I mean, it's ridiculous. But a lot of people like to cite increases in pediatric accidental ingestion ER admissions. And when, while that sounds scary, when you actually look at the numbers, you're talking about a couple hundred cases where there are 100,000 plus admissions in the United States for consumption or accidental consumption of cosmetics alone. All right. So we're talking about a very, very small number overall, but what looks like a big percentage uptick. And that's something that prohibitionists like to cite all the time. But what they don't talk about is the fact that, A, none of these kids are dying from accidental ingestion of cannabis. B, people are a lot more likely to take their kids to the emergency room when they know that they don't have to worry about getting arrested or getting custody removed because of that accidental ingestion. And C, when you really get right down to it, this is an issue of parental responsibility. And, a lot of the people that like to, hem and haw about this sort of stuff really completely ignore the fact that when it comes down to it, you're responsible for the safety of your own home.
Right. And educating your children. And it would help if you were educated to do that too.
And public education across the board is something that is useful. I mean, we saw that instituted in Colorado in terms of telling people start low, go slow when you're eating edibles. storing your edibles and other cannabis products out of reach of children. We've seen in state after state these public service educational programs that are having a real impact. And that, we've seen the same thing with tobacco and alcohol, that public education does way more than criminal penalties could ever do in terms of promoting responsible behavior.
Right. 100% on that, Morgan. We're all for it. Josh, you got any other things you want to add or ask Morgan before we break? It's okay. No pressure. No pressure.
There might be more synthetic urine on the market. If there's no federal drug testing, there's going to be some of these drug tests that are no longer needed, and then people can go out and buy their 10 ounces at the federal level. I think that's a great thing.
That's not something I see on the shelf of the stores that I shop in. Is that in Washington State?
Well, you got to go to like a Hedge shop or whatever to get the fake pee, but yeah, it's out there. It works.
All right, fair enough. Morgan Fox, as always, a pleasure to talk with you, sir. Support NORML, support all those institutions out there that are in the trenches, making the difference in Washington, D.C., trying hard to do that. And coming up after this break, we've got two groups. I think Morgan's very familiar with one of them. The NCIA, Aaron Smith is coming on. He is the official, I think he's the CEO, and the executive director, Amber Littlejohn of MCBA, the Minorities Cannabis Business Association. So that's what's coming up next. Don't go away. It's 420. Kick back, enjoy, and we'll be back with more of Green Rush Live after this. Don't go away.
With that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is The Talking Hedge. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out. Don't forget to smash that like button on your way out and check out these other videos that we've got.